Welcome to the Lift Your Story podcast with guest Kurian Tharakan, founder of Strategy Peak Sales and Marketing Advisor. Hi, everyone. I am LaurieAnn. I am that gal from Toronto, Canada, and I am with.
I am that guy. I am Roy Miller from Dallas, Texas. Welcome to our Lift Your Story podcast.
In this episode, we welcome Kurian Tharakan, and he is the founder and Strategy Peak Sales and Marketing Advisor, and he's also an author.
Yes, and you're an author as well. So tell us the name of your book.
Well, the book I wrote last year was titled The 7 Essential Stories Charismatic Leaders Tell.
Okay, that fascinates me because that says it's like 7 stories in the story world that you need for sales and marketing.
For leadership, actually, including sales and marketing. So it's actually a leadership book, but there's 2 types of leadership that it can apply to. There's internal leadership to show your people a path forward. And then there's external leadership to show market leadership as well. And the 7 stories answer the primal questions that people have in their minds, whether they be your people or whether you want, or the market as a whole.
So how did you develop these stories?
Well, I took a look around and, I'd always wanted to write a book. And it struck me that there were plenty of books that were out there that told you how to tell a story, but very few that told you about what stories to tell. And if I look at, I fell back to this line by one of Apple's very first marketing consultants, right at the very, very beginning, when it was just a circuit board, in between some plywood. And it was a fellow by the name of Regis McKenna. And his basic line was, and I'm paraphrasing, it was that all great marketing takes its cues from great religion. And so great religion, if you think about it, there's been thousands of religions throughout human history. If we take a look at modern humans, they've been around perhaps 200,000 years right now. They've been speaking in some way for about 1.7 million, something like that, right? But getting together in one place, maybe over just the last 12,000 years, 5,000 years ago, there came writing. And, and so all these things kind of coalesce. And in that time, religion always had a major part in these people's lives, from nomadic tribes, right down to now you're congregating in villages and you're growing your own food now instead of hunting and gathering for it. Well, those religions, and there's been thousands along that way, allowed people to make sense of their world. Why did that flood happen? Why did the fire occur? Why did people die? What happens after death? And religion allowed them to create the stories to answer these questions. That may not be self-evident, that you have to project forward in some way to something that you cannot calculate on your own. And if you take a look at the stories that religion tries to understand and then provide a truth for, and it's their version of the truth, right? Whatever that religion is, you will find it in these 7 basic stories.
That's fascinating. And I really never thought of that, because you do find, like, there's the Buddhists, there's the Christians, there's all of these different religions, and definitely right from the start with all of the calligraphy, the wall calligraphy or whatever they did, shows that there was religion way before even the religions that we know today. That's
and
fascinating.
The religions we know today are very new for the most part. Judaism is a 5,000-year-old tradition, but there's only 14 million adherents in the world today. Right at the top, you have Christianity, which is an offshoot of Judaism. You have about 2.1 billion people under under Christianity, 1.8 billion Muslims. And those 3 are all Abrahamic religions. Mm-hmm. And so they all come from Abraham the father, and they follow a basic monotheistic, binding big idea, this one God. And but they worship in different ways. And they have different traditions and different customs and such. And they may also be at each other's throats from time to time, right? And so it's interesting, though, that they all come from the same basic tenets. They all have the Garden of Eden story They all have Adam and Eve and the banishment from that perfect place, and on it goes. The Great Flood. If you take a look at the stories of the Great Flood, that's a universal story. Just almost every culture in the world today, every civilization has had a story about the Great Flood, regardless of who they worship. So why is that? And you have to go back to these basic primal questions that people have in their heads in order to make sense of the world, so they know who they are today, where they came from, and where they're going to, and have certainty in those next few footsteps.
So in your leadership training, how do you use this in your leadership?
Well, we have to understand that, the idea of, if we go back to this idea of great religions and great marketing takes its cues from great religion. In order for a religion to grow from a band of, a bunch of little, crazy nuts that broke away from the main Jewish congregation back 2,000 years ago. Well, what allowed them to become this 2.1 billion adherents worldwide? How did that happen? Well, there's clearly some very profound stories involved, big ideas. There's proselytization, communication channels, all those kinds of things. And so you have to understand that at the core of all of this is these 7 primal questions. And those 7 primal questions exist whether or not you think they do. They exist in people's head. I'll tell you what the 7 stories are. You're probably wondering what the 7 stories are.
Exactly.
Roy, so let me go to that. And these are the primal questions. The very first one is creation and origin. Where did we come from? Why were we created? The Bible and the Torah and the Quran all try and understand to relate this to you. What is your purpose in God's creation? What is your role here on earth? What is it that you're trying to do? Creation and origin. So you're trying to understand where we came from. Story 2 is all about our identity, beliefs, and values. Who are we as people? What do we aspire to? What are our central guiding principles? What do we hold in highest esteem? What must we never violate? And what must we always hold on to? And so, a lot of it is perhaps put into these 10 commandments. That's entirely possible. But every organization has their own little version of the 10 commandments. 10 commandments are table stakes. You shouldn't be killing your, colleague. You shouldn't be cheating your colleague, those kind of things. But there's clearly other things that we value. Now, if you take a look at FedEx, one of the clearest things that they value is absolutely, positively overnight. That is a high order value of theirs, that reliability is going to happen regardless of what happened, whatever else. Now, Purolator doesn't have the same timeliness aspect of it, but they do still guarantee the certainty. It'll get there. It may not get there overnight, but it'll get there. My rail, train, air, we're not sure yet, but you're going to pay 1/3 the price of what a FedEx will be. Story 3 is all about the big idea. What is that central organizing principle that brings everything together in one place? What is it that we try and rotate around and to create value through? And so what is that? And we go back to FedEx again, it's that central binding idea, absolutely positively overnight. And, if you go to Southwest Airlines, or the Canadian equivalent is perhaps WestJet, it is just the absolute certainty of, very timely flights at the lowest possible fare. Now, the interesting part of that is that the central organizing principle with Southwest and airlines like that is that their most basic strategy is to keep the planes in the air. If it's not in the air, we're not making money. Now, that's common knowledge to everybody else. United Airlines, that's common knowledge. Here's the difference. Southwest and companies like Southwest, airlines like Southwest, they live that high order principle. So they have no, food served on their flights. Which means lower grooming times. It's usually, so you don't have, lower grooming times, right? So you don't have reservations for the most part. They have scrambled seating as much as possible. They only fly 737 jets so that every mechanic knows every other plane. So you can put pilots and mechanics in the same place. Now they have some, you know, leeway from that. They're flying different kinds of jets these days and such. But for the most part, all of these things have a standardization to it, which allows for faster pushback times and a higher utilization rates of the planes, which means that everybody's making more money. Story 4, by the way, interject here, jump in here if you want. Otherwise, I'll just keep talking. So here's the fourth one. Fourth one, the enemy we face. So enemies don't have to be people. They can be forces of nature. It can be preparing for this. There's a big hurricane coming towards Florida right now. I forget what it's called, right? But it's on its way. You're preparing for it. That is the current enemy. But enemy is either something that we fight against or we fight for. So we might fight against childhood poverty, or we might fight for childhood literacy or adult literacy. And so now we have something that is in opposition to, that we are trying to overcome. And when we overcome it, we have a sense of mission. Story 5 is all about the mighty winds. And what I say is that almost every company, not almost every company, every organization, every company is a sailing ship, not a powerboat, a sailing ship. And why it's a sailing ship is that it needs to be on trend with the mighty winds. Right. And so all ships, sailing ships, need wind to power the sails. The problem is most entrepreneurs run out there and they build the ship without ever ascertaining the direction, speed, or availability of the wind. And so the big wins we're talking about here are macro trends, societal trends, technological trends, economic, environmental, political, and legislative trends. I love to tell this story about 1994. And so LaurieAnn and I remember 1994 for sure. Certainly Roy. That's when NAFTA 1 happened, North American Free Trade Agreement. And that was being negotiated for years, but it happened in 1994. I think it was 94. There was a company in town here that was doing an absolute booming business in CD rentals, compact disc rentals. We all remember compact discs. So you didn't have to go down to the HMV anymore or Sam the Record Man to buy your compact disc. You went down and you rented it. And who knows what you did with it once you got home. Maybe you ripped a couple of songs off of it, right? But you got to go and rent the CD. And this guy was doing a booming business. So booming, in fact, that he decided to open up a second store in a city 3 hours south of here called Calgary. So Edmonton, Calgary. And he opened it up just in time for NAFTA 1 to take place, which made it illegal to rent compact discs. And so both stores had to be shut down. Now, why I laugh is that no one did their due diligence. You know, this thing didn't come up overnight. It was being negotiated for years, absolute years. And so you had this ability to pivot or at least not open up that second store and maybe just harvest, you know, the sales you got from the first store. But he was just absolutely clobbered by that, absolutely clobbered. If you take a look at 1903, you have this idea of flight that happens with the Wright brothers. Now, that could not have taken place without the advent of smaller internal combustion engines. So that whole ICE, internal combustion engine, allowed the powering of flight to take place in 1903. Now, that couldn't have happened in 1801, you know, but this is a long-term trend. And you can see what the ICE, the internal combustion engine, has done over the past 60, 70, 80, 100 years. Now, what might be interesting to you is that it was competing with all sorts of other macro trends at that time as well that petered out. And so on the technology, there's a technology macro trend. At the very beginning of the internal combustion engines, you know, they were competing with steam engines and electric cars. And electric cars were around with lead acid batteries well before internal combustion engines were. The problem was they didn't last very long. The lead batteries. And the other part of it was that, you know, this idea of pushing out the electrical grid into the U.S. especially, that was the big hotbed for the market, was much more difficult than putting out another gas station into rural America. And so the internal combustion engine takes place, and guess what follows on it? Suburbanization, because now people can get ahead farther. McDonald's and every other fast food franchise would not exist without the car. You know, couldn't exist. So then you get into big, interstate freeway systems and all sorts of things. And it brings us all the way down to climate change. So, and that's all part of burning fossil fuels as well. And that was based on a decision, not even a decision, it was an economic decision back in the early 1900s that we are going to build internal combustion engines and not electric cars, not battery powered cars. And it's amazing where things go. And who knows where we'd be with battery technology now if that other decision was there. Maybe that would be a whole different level of pollution with lithium battery, waste piles all over the place. But we're here now on this basis. Story 6 is all about the journey we must undertake. Now, the journey we must undertake is, so if the first 5 stories are correct, there's a little equal sign. If the first 5 stories are believable to your people, there's a little equal sign, and absolutely equals the journey we must undertake. It's conclusive. Of course we need to do that. And so where are we going to go? Why are we doing it? Because it's all on the left side of the equation. That's why we're doing it. All those 5 stories are there. And now we're going to move forward in this direction, because that's the direction we are going to win. Or are we? And that's story 7. And the story 7 is the why we will win narrative. And why we will win takes all the previous 6 stories and puts them into one telling with the addition of keystone elements. And what a keystone element is something that guarantees the win, at least in the minds of your adherents. And so some very common keystones throughout history have been God is with us, superior technology, superior people, superior strategy. It could be a lot of different things that give you the edge in the upcoming conflict and on the journey we must undertake. And those are the 7 stories.
It's amazing. In all of these, there's sort of this, you think about it right from the time you were saying from Judaism to Christianity, moving on. It's almost like an old version of what's viral today. Word of mouth, passing on, and would you believe that even marketing has a big part of that, is them believing in the story and it becoming viral? I mean, they didn't have television, they didn't have internet, they didn't have anything, and yet it grew. It's fascinating.
Well, I read a great one of the it's an interesting little book. I did a ton of research for the book, right? I just didn't make this up. And each of those chapters are illustrated with real stories. There is one little anecdote there about the 1955 Fortune 500 list. And about 50 years later, 80% of that list was gone. It was gone. And, they just disappeared. It was all sorts of different names or big time names in 1955 that ceased to exist. Now, companies just don't cease to exist. They actually wither away. They just don't automatically go like this unless there's a massive fraud. Things like Enron and WorldCom, MCI, things like that. Those are big fraud type of things. It was never a real company to begin with. But for the most part, you wither away. But your products don't wither first. Your products do not fail first. What fails first is the story, the functional relevance and emotional significance of the story, specifically the big idea, the key messages that come out of it, and the strategic narrative that has your customer as hero. Right? And I'll tell you something that happened to me just the other day. So about 6 years ago, I bought a set of tiles for my keys. So here's my little keychain right now, right? And there's a little tile right here. And that tile allowed me to track wherever the keychain went. And in fact, when I went traveling, I take that tile off and toss in my luggage, so I knew whether the luggage had made it with me. And it worked brilliantly, right? Now, Apple just brought out their AirTags. Now, the difference between Apple's AirTags and these tiles is, if I take a look in Edmonton right now, there's 2,300 tile users around you, where there are over 1 billion Apple devices that are also tracking that tile. And now I disabled my tiles and I bought 4 AirTags. So, overnight, your industry has failed. Now, I didn't buy the AirTag first. I bought the promise of the AirTag story. Okay, and that's what had to formulate in my mind first before I could physically go down to the Best Buy and purchase for the hardware devices. The story is the very first thing that you buy.
I'm intrigued because you are in Canada, and the reason why I was living in Edmonton is because my dad worked for Nortel. That was a company that dwindled. And we lived in Turkey, we moved around a few places, Montreal and everything. And at the onset, that was one of the most prestigious, most family-oriented companies ever. And then suddenly the families were kicked out. You weren't a part of it. And just a whole culture changed. And it just kept going. So that's a very interesting fact that you're saying, but could it be also part of the management that causes that whole dip?
Well, absolutely correct. Who tells the stories? Who approves the stories to tell? Who creates the story? It's got to be leadership. And, the line staff, the regular army guys in a war setting, are not the people to blame for anything. It's always a leadership issue. You always have to look at leadership. If something is failing, it is not failing at the ground level. It is failing at the planning, strategy level, and the execution part. And that is always a leadership issue. But it starts with a story. What stories do you tell?
Yeah.
I work for a company that the manager of our office in Dallas, he was so afraid to change anything because he was afraid the corporate would say, "Why? It's been working for 25 years. Why did you change it?" It was so bad. They had an estimating system that was DOS based.
Yeah.
And they bought like 25 dot matrix printers, like Okidata printers. That tells you how far back that was.
Yeah.
Because just to that one, instead of there's all kinds of stuff that's more up to date and versatile, but they wouldn't change. And I'm like, it didn't make any sense to me.
Yeah, it's quite foolish actually, because there is a concept in business strategy called strategic drift. And strategic drift, if you take a look at the macro trends that we talked about, basically says that the industry you're in is always moving forward. The markets you serve are always moving forward. The competition that you have is always doing something different. So your ground is always shifting underneath you. And beyond that, the environment as a whole, right? The macro trends, government policy, all these things. The ground is always shifting. So the ground that you have today is not the ground that you will be fighting on tomorrow. It can't be. Definitely not a year from now, or definitely not 10 years from now. And one of the best stories to illustrate that is that both Bill Gates and Steve Jobs apparently missed the internet, the early dawn of the internet. And the dawn of the internet, 1969 was DARPANET, but 1994 you had the World Wide Web. So apparently they missed, that window there. And when the interviewer asked Steve Jobs what he was going to do, he just very casually said, "I'm going to wait for the next big thing." And it was this absolute and utter realization that this is like moving ground. There's going to be another window of opportunity that no one's even thought of yet, or in the way of possibility. But when that opens, I'm going to be ready for that. And, and his biggest successes were yet to come. The iPhone, the iPad, the iPod, all those kind of things. And all of those would be a fraction of their usefulness if it weren't for the internet, if it weren't for the World Wide Web. And so this idea that you can just stay still and rely on the products you have today, absolutely crazy. 3M, I think, has a policy that 3 to 5% of the revenue has to come from new product lines every year. Something like that, 3 to 5% from new product lines that are other innovations or inventions.
Yeah, I can remember when cell phones came out, how, oh my gosh, you can, and then the big brick you carried around, and then fax machines.
Yep.
Oh my gosh, I can actually just send somebody something. I have to sit on the phone and read out this list and wait for them to, and then all of a sudden, nobody has a fax machine anymore.
Yeah. Well, do you know when the first fax machine came out?
No.
1843. It was 6 feet tall. It was 6 feet tall. It was a pendulum, 6 feet tall. And the pendulum had a stylus. In 1836 came the telegraph. and the stylus had electrical conductivity. And wherever there's conductive material, it would transmit. And when there wasn't conductive material, it wouldn't transmit. It was a pendulum, it was steady momentum, steady beat. And they strung a telegraph line between the palaces of Napoleon III, between Lyon, France, and Paris. And this was how they communicated long distance at that point in time.
Wow.
Now, I beg to differ. I do apologize, Rory, but the fax machine is still very much in check with banks and government. You cannot, it has to be by fax. You cannot do it electronically. It's got to be faxed to that certain number, which is surprising. But I remember working as well when I was a service advisor at the dealership. All the contracts, everything that we put through was only by fax, not by electronic.
It's not as prolific as it was at one time.
But I'm surprised it's still there because you hear that and you're going, whoa, that's so ancient.
Every doctor's office in this city has a fax machine. That's the way the medical practices communicate with the health services, right? It's crazy to me. It makes no sense.
Yeah.
I mean, you can secure now and put passwords on things, but no, they will not. It has to be, be fax.
It's not like it used to be. I mean, it's like, oh, just fax that to me. Oh, I have a fax at home. Send me a fax. I can get it, And now, now this, welcome.
They have e-fax lines now as well. You can digitally transmit to an e-fax line, right? And then it shows up as a scanned image in your email. So
that is really cool. I remember when they first came out with that, I'm thinking, woo, I could, you just pay a little bit of a fee and you can fax out whatever you need. And that was it. Just one time only if you needed to. Yeah. It was great.
Yeah.
Well, it's still here, but when I first found out about it, I was excited. I love technology. So like I've been a geek since, computers came out when I had my EX.
That was
my EX 1000 that had no hard drive. It was a Tandy EX. It had no hard drive. I had the extra hard drive when it did finally come out.
Yeah.
$2,000.
Your Commodore 64.
Love that machine. Had one.
Started with that. Yeah. I know. But I'm excited. I don't know about you. I mean, these are amazing. What you're relaying to us is really amazing, but it has been, and we're talking about older technology and history, but I do have to say I'm really happy that I started at the beginning, had a childhood where there was really no technology at all. There were no gaming things or anything, but to watch it grow has been fascinating. And I would imagine what you would equate it to, Kurian, is also how fast something can change. And that's how fast business can change. What you're saying, you're not on the same battleground.
Calm tomorrow.
Yeah, the speed at which change can occur, either forward or backwards. If you see Afghanistan right now, they're not going forward. Yeah. That is an absolute rebellion against anything modern, and it goes back to a 6th or 7th century mentality, a tradition of what everybody's role is, and this idea of a theocracy that is should be in charge, right? Well, the vast majority of the world abandoned that hundreds of years ago, but Afghanistan has had this constant series of invasions, right, over those times. The earliest one I can remember is Alexander the Great, but it's right on that pathway between the East and the West. And so they've been invaded multiple times by a lot of people. The Russians were there twice. The Brits were there twice. The Americans were just there for 20 years. And ultimately, the culture, and the front part of my book is all about culture, because that's what you infuse the stories in. The culture won. The culture of the Pashtun people won in Afghanistan. And no matter how hard you try to install your Western ideas, it can only be installed in open minds. And I'm not even saying that Western ideals are right. I'm simply saying that if you want to change culture, that it has to be something that is willingly absorbed and not forcefully put on, because it'll never stick.
Everybody resists being forced.
And that fascinated me too, because being in Turkey, it was in from 1970 to 1974. But I remember this Atatürk. Then he was westernizing Turkey with, the changing the alphabet, and it really changed the dynamics of Turkey by him doing that.
Yeah, absolutely right.
Yeah.
Yeah, and if you take a look at, working with an absolute almost zero ground, you just have to look to probably the 50s to Singapore. And Singapore was just a backwater island next to Malaysia that people like Lee Kuan Yew single-handedly, by force of sheer will and vision and mission and the 7 stories. And, these 7 stories aren't my 7 stories. This is me identifying the stories that powerful leaders throughout history have used. And if you take a look at that, that's why he was able to literally drag that nation into the modern world, where it has no natural resources to speak of. It has nothing to really to mold other than the minds and the drive of its people. So how do you do that? You have to do that in a way that paints such a clear vision of where this country can go, and not just rely on, and in Canada, what's the old thing? We are hewers of wood and I guess deliverers of oil now. But, those are all resource-based things. The future belongs to people that have minds and vision and the ability to see things that aren't even contemplated today. And when those things come together, that's how futures are created. It's not futures are rarely just straight line extrapolations. They are often jumps in absolute logic, defying possibility. If you take a look at the Wright brothers took off in 1903. Well, 66 years later, the Americans were landing people on the moon. That's only 66 years later. How does that happen? And it wasn't a straight line. This had to happen with exponential leaps in imagination and then exploiting the technology available at that day.
So true.
So how can our listeners reach out to you?
Okay, so if you come to strategypeak.com, on the right side, you'll find all my contact details, but you can also download a couple of chapters of the book for yourself. But I'll tell you what, Roy, for the first 5 of your listeners that reach out to me, and I'll get this for your show notes, to me and tell me that they heard me on your show, I will send them a free Kindle copy of the book.
Wow. Okay. So you get your book on Amazon.
Absolutely. Get your book on Amazon. That is correct.
Cool.
Beautiful.
Wow, man.
And definitely we will have the links for our listeners for them to be able to contact you. This has been really fascinating. This really
has.
Really enjoyed this conversation. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you so much for being a guest.
Okay. Absolutely. Thank you very much, LaurieAnn. Thanks for having me on your show.
Take care.
Bye-bye.
Thank you for listening to this episode. Be sure to visit us at lifterstory.com.